Today's scripture is from Matthew chapter 24, verses 3 to 14. When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us when this will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, and the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Then they will hand you over to be tortured and will put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations, and the end will come." This is the word of the Lord.
So as many of you know, before I was appointed here, I worked for our annual conference. And what that meant for me is that while I lived in Montana, I had a 4-state area to take care of. And I made many a trip from Billings, where I was living, especially down here, to Denver, where most everybody else was. And I liked to drive that trip. Technically, I could have flown, but flying from Billings to Denver, with Denver Airport's way out there, and Billings Airport is kind of small and tiny, doesn't actually save you all that much time, I discovered. So I would rather drive. And I got very good at it because I would do it sometimes 2 or 3 times a month, make that trip. Because I also like to see my family. So I would go home every once in a while as well. And on one of these trips, when I thought, I've done this a million times, I know what I'm doing, I got to about Casper, which, if you know geographically, is about the halfway point, only to remember that I had forgotten something rather important. I had forgotten my laptop. And I am not the kind of person that can really do much of anything without their laptop, especially work-related, and especially what I was going to go do. So I had a choice. I'm like, am I going to turn around and drive 3.5, 4 hours back home to get my laptop, and then, turn around and drive back? How is this going to work? But then I realized that, oh yeah, we live in the 21st century, and the 21st century is awesome. So I called home, and they were able to take my laptop and take it to FedEx, the local FedEx office, and it caught the last plane out there and flew to Memphis or wherever it is that FedEx flies to, and then made it to Denver, and actually beat me to the office that morning. Because again, they're awesome. Now, we kind of take for granted that this is one of those things that happens and that we live in a world where these things are true. But I'd actually once heard a rather profound interview by the guy named Frederick Smith, who is actually the founder of FedEx. And he, when he first dreamed it up in 1962 while he was in graduate school, he wrote a paper, and the paper was called "Overnight Delivery Service in the Computer Information Age." And what he recognized is that technology had gotten to the point where something like this was actually possible, between computer systems and jet airplanes and all that kind of stuff. And so FedEx is really the company that originated this notion that you could actually move letters and small parcels overnight great distances. This was not something that was available to human beings before this. Now, this was such an obvious and, in his mind, very obvious and very necessary thing, that he assumed that this would be something that'd be pretty easy to get funding for, that people would see the value in, and so long as he could get it done first, as long as he could be the first one to try do it, he would inevitably be successful. And in the beginning, it kind of looked like that's the way it was going to go. And he got 1-2 years into operations. People were starting to figure out the value of the service. And all of that. But around year 3, he started to run into a lot of problems. And the biggest problem he ran into was cash flow, right? Yes, he was making money. Yes, people were using his service to deliver things, but he wasn't making enough to cover the bills in the early 70s. And there's also this other thing happened in the early 70s called, the fuel crisis. I wasn't there, I'll be honest. Some of you might remember it. But the price of fuel went up dramatically, but not just for cars, but for airplanes too. And this really hit the bottom line of companies like FedEx at a time when they were feeling very, very vulnerable. And in fact, it got to the point where Federal Express, as an entire company at the time, had only about $5,000 in the bank, which wasn't enough to even pay their aircraft fuel bill. And he flew to California to talk to somebody about some financing. It did not work out there. And in basically a fit of despair and not knowing what to do and feeling like this whole thing that he was about to end and collapse around him, instead of flying home, he decided to do something else, and he flew to Las Vegas. And he spent the weekend in Las Vegas with the $5,000 playing blackjack. And in one of those stories that is, he says it so it must be true, by the time he got to Monday morning, he had $32,000 to deposit in the bank, which just so happens to be about as much as they needed to cover their fuel bill for another month, and buying them a month so that they could then go and find the additional funding that they need, which obviously they found because Federal Express continues to be a thing today. Now, please be clear. Do not leave here and say, Jeremy Scott supports gambling. Because I do not. And as Methodists, we actually have a statement that says we are not in favor of gambling. So I am not saying if life gets hard, go to Vegas and spend all your money. No. And in fact, this is one of those stories, though, that is fun to tell because it worked out. But there are so many other stories, in fact, far more stories of people who end up in this moment of feeling lost, in this moment of feeling despair, who make similar choices, and they do not win $32,000 at the blackjack table. In fact, most stories end up that way. But this occurrence, this idea that there comes this moment when things get really, really hard and despair really, really starts to feel overwhelming, is understood to be such a common part of especially anybody trying to do anything new that we've given it a name, and we call it the Valley of Despair. And anyways, I've worked at high-tech startups, I've worked with church planters, and a bunch of other people who have been trying to do new things in the world, and inevitably there comes a point where they reach this point where that initial excitement of wanting to do something and being excited about whatever's going on kind of wears off, and the sheer amount of work and time and energy that this thing they're trying to do is actually going to take sinks in. And there's almost this inevitable reaction, of a negative experience of that. So much so that if you open up any kind of business book or sociology book or whatever, you will find something along a curve along these lines, and they'll talk about that moment or that period called the Valley of Despair. Right? We see this when we're trying to do new things. We see this in relationships. I have been blessed in my life, in my ministry, to get to work with and counsel a lot of new couples when they're first getting married, and it's all very wonderful. And in that new marital counseling, I always try to work in, yes, you're all very excited in your love right now, and it's great and it's special and it's wonderful. Around year 3, things are really going to start to bug you about each other. That's normal. That's okay. Eventually, the honeymoon really does wear off. I'm sorry. So you're still sitting there, you're smiling. You're my most recent wedding, the slave makers. Love you to death. But there comes, and those of us, if you've had a significant relationship, even a significant friendship or whatever, right? Excitement of greeting a new child. They're great and wonderful for those first few weeks, and then you realize you're not going to sleep again forever. Right? And so life offers us these moments a lot, and so much so, again, that we've given them a name. Now, this is not a modern phenomenon. This is not something that human beings have invented only in the last 100 years. It has been part and parcel of the human experience pretty much from the beginning. You can find ancient writings that have similar ideas to it. And this is the exact phenomenon that Jesus recognizes is coming for him and the disciples, and that he's concerned about. Because at this moment in the scripture, we have our Bible in front of us. We have Matthew in front of us. We know where we are heading, right? We know that we are in Holy Week, at least as far as this part of the story goes. We know that Good Friday and Easter are just around the corner, but the people at the time don't know that. And so Jesus has been going through these past several days. He's been sparring with the religious leaders, and the disciples have been around him and seeing him do this and be successful at doing it that whole time. And so no doubt they are fairly convinced that they have joined the right team. Right? These folks have been wandering with Jesus through the desert, going from village to village with him. They've seen him perform miracles. They themselves have performed miracles. They've helped heal people. They've helped feed people. They saw loaves and fishes feed 5,000 people in the desert. They've listened to all of his teachings. They watched people come out on Palm Sunday and lay their cloaks down as if he was a visiting king. Right? They've got to feel pretty good about where they are and who they are with. And despite the fact that Jesus has actually been trying to tell them more than once about where things are heading, which is they're about to hit a pretty major roadblock, they don't really seem to want to listen. Because they come to this moment and they ask Jesus in private again, well, all the rest of the crowds aren't around Jesus, and where all that riffraff isn't here to hear. Like, obviously, we are your inner circle as the disciples. Why don't you just let us know when is like the big moment going to happen, right? Like, when is the big moment going to happen when you will be in your full glory and God will come down and he'll kick the Romans out and we'll get to sit on your left and your right hand in the kingdom of God? Like, just tell us when that's going to happen. We're thinking next Tuesday. And Jesus, once again, reminds them in no uncertain terms, as he does multiple times, you'll know when you know, but that's not for you to know. And then he kind of burst their bubble. In fact, he very much burst their bubble. And once again, this is not the first time he did it, not the last time he's going to do it, but pretty much directly tells them that things are actually going to get far harder, far more difficult. This is going to take far longer than any of you are planning for in this moment. And Jesus recognizes they're riding high on all the amazing things that they have seen, but he needs them to know that there is more coming. And the more that is coming is actually going to be quite difficult. It's going to be quite challenging for them and people around them. So much so that people who are there now playing for the team thinking, I'm all in on this Jesus thing, are going to fall away. And that they themselves, the disciples, the chosen ones, are going to have their own problems and challenges moving forward from the place they are now. Jesus knows that they are standing at the precipice of the valley of despair, and he's trying his best to make them aware of it and give them some pointers and give them some strategies for how to get through it. So this begins really what in the Gospel of Matthew is Jesus' last selection of teachings, and really is the complement to the Sermon on the Mount, which was at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, where we've got Jesus' first teaching, big chunk of teaching that was for the whole world. Here we have Jesus talking to the disciples and telling them what they need to know, because he knows that it's about to get very hard for them, and he wants them to understand how they can best get through it. The disciples are making the mistake that a lot of us make, which is that we think that progress is linear, that today was better than yesterday and tomorrow is going to be better than today, and that process will just simply continue and continue and continue forever. And for most days, in some days, it kind of feels like that is true. And oftentimes it feels like it's true until we reach a point where we realize that it is not. Before something interjects or I don't know where that word went, but it went somewhere, distracts us from that thing. Now, if you ask people, Pew Research has done some research around different things, how different people feel about things. And one of the things they ask a lot about is how do we feel about things like crime? And if you ask general people, if you say, do you believe that there is more crime today than there was 30 years ago? Most people will actually say yes, even though the exact opposite is true. Right? By every measure, there's actually far less crime today than there was 30 years ago. The challenge is that it's not a linear progression down. It tends to go up and down and up and down and up and down, even though the overall trajectory is lower. The problem is we don't tend to notice, and it doesn't tend to get reported on all that much when it goes down. And it very much gets noticed, and it very much gets reported on when it goes up. Right? And so it leaves us with this perception about the world that is actually untrue. Right? It's not that there is no crime today, far from it. And it's not that there aren't things to worry about. Please lock your car doors. Please don't leave here saying, Jeremy says we can gamble and we don't have to lock our car doors. Nope, not saying that. But the volatility, because it is not linear and it tends to go up and down, up and down, up and down over time, there's the parts that we perceive, and then there's the parts that we don't. Jesus knows that things are going to be hard for the disciples. It's not that it's always going to be hard. There will be moments of excitement. There will be times of joy. There will be times when they are out there proclaiming the good news and people are hearing and listening and the crowds are coming and it's going to feel great and wonderful. Jesus knows that that's coming as well, but he also knows that before they get there, there's a time they are going to have to live through that we know as the valley of despair. So what do we do, and how do we get through those hard times? Well, if you keep reading in Matthew's gospel, he's going to tell them how we do it. And what I find interesting and not at all surprising is that when people who work with entrepreneurs and people like that are coaching them on how to get through the valley of sorrow today in their projects, they get largely the same advice. And Jesus will talk about it in slightly different terms, and he'll tell us stories about watchful servants, and he'll tell us stories about using our talents for good and all of that, but it breaks down to basically the same thing. One is to embrace that difficult times are part of life. They are not fully avoidable. We will not get out of our time here on earth without facing troubles and facing trials. We have to embrace that that is part of life the way that we live it. For good or for bad, that is true. So when we find ourselves going through hard times, one of the first things we have to do is recognize and embrace the fact that, yes, this is in fact a difficult time. Yes, my life is not where I want it to be. Yes, there are things that are outside of my control that I don't like, and there are things that feel like they're happening to me or around me that I would prefer were different that I can't change. And that does not feel good, and none of us like it when we're in those places. So the first thing we have to do when we're going through struggles is be honest with ourselves that we are indeed struggling. We may put on a brave face for the world, but God knows. God knows our hearts, and God knows our spirits, and God knows when we are feeling troubled. And so we need to embrace, at least in our life in prayer with God, the reality of the fact that sometimes we all go through some stuff. The next piece of advice is basically to not overreact. Jesus knows they're going to go through some hard times, but those hard times are not going to be permanent. They're not always going to be there. They will, in fact, get through if they follow Jesus' way and the advice that he has for them. So the point is basically we actually don't and should not go to Vegas and bet it all on black, right? And make no assumptions about God's like or dislike of you, because God's not touching that roulette wheel, I hate to tell you. That is not up to us. But we should not overreact, but instead take some time and energy and take some time to pause. In fact, the exact opposite of that. Sometimes when we are going through the hardest times, the most important thing we can do is just stop and be still for a moment. to get our bearings and figure out where we truly are and who is around us. And then the final piece of advice that both Jesus and coaches today will give you is focus on what you can control. When Jesus tells the story of the talents, which is one of Jesus' most famous teachings, right, where one person buries their talents in the ground and ignores it and doesn't do anything with it, and the other one chooses to invest it and go out and do God's good work with it, Jesus praises the one who's willing to go and do what they can. None of us, we have it, this is so important, we printed it and we put it on the back wall. We can't do everything. When we are in that valley of despair, when we're going through trying times, oftentimes we are there because we feel overwhelmed because there's so much to do and there feels like there's so much going on, there's so much wrong in the world or so much wrong in our lives. How can we possibly fix it all? Well, the answer is you can't. And Jesus knows it. But somewhere in there is something you can do. Somewhere in there is an opportunity for you to improve your life or somebody else's. Somewhere in there is an opportunity to love God, love neighbor, and love yourself. And that is what we should focus on, because we are actually not supposed to, nor are we intended to fix everything, each one of us, because we can't do it. But there is something we are intended to do. Jesus will actually wrap up this teaching section that he's beginning with this story about how hard things are going to be for the disciples. He's going to actually end that section with another one of his most famous quotes, where he says, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you," the kingdom he just talked about at the beginning of the teaching, "from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." And then, of course, the people respond to Jesus, "Jesus, we didn't do that for you. When did we do that? I don't remember doing that. I don't remember seeing you. You've been gone for a while." And then, of course, Jesus famously says, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me." The way that we get through the valley and through the hard times is by loving God, loving each other, and loving ourselves. Way that we get through the hard times most often is to find somebody else who has also been through a similar or other hard time, to find other people who can support us and encourage us through it. That is oftentimes the most important thing we can ever do for each other. And that's exactly what Jesus is talking about. When we support each other, love each other, equip each other to get through the difficulties of life, we are not only helping our neighbor, we are loving God and loving Christ the way that God specifically and directly commanded us to. Currently, my wife Emily has a best friend. Her name is Monica, and she's one of those friends that she's had basically since middle school kind of thing. They grew up together. They did some college time together, and even though they live in different parts of the world now, she's back in South Carolina, and we're obviously here. They speak regularly, and they're together regularly, and they support each other in that way that only decades-old friends can. Well, Monica's husband, she got married only a few years ago, and Monica's husband, who's a great guy, unfortunately also has brain cancer. Monica is an oncology nurse by trade and knows exactly what he's going through, knows what the treatments are, and knows exactly where this is going to go, which is not anywhere good. And they have reached that point where they need to start thinking about what do they want to do together with the time that they have left, because that is the reality that they are living in. And so Monica talked to Emily and said, "I think we're going to take one last big trip together, somewhere we've always wanted to go. And I know it's a really busy time, but if you wanted to come, you could." And when Emily brought this up to me, I'm like, okay. And she's like, "Yeah, I just wish I could go." And I'm like, okay. And she's like, "Yeah, but we just bought a house. We've got all this stuff going on, and I got this stuff going at my church and all that other stuff." And I'm like, "I understand. And you need to be there for your friend. You need to go." And she's like, "Well, I don't think we can both go." And I'm like, "No, I don't think we can. I think I need to stay at home and take care of this brood of children that we have. But you need to go, and you need to be with your friend, and you need to have fun, and you need to make some memories while you can. Why would you not do that? And so she will, by the way, be going. And when I was talking to her about that, I was reminded of my oldest friend, Brian, who's come up a time or two before. My friend Brian, and I've talked about this before, but my friend Brian, whose oldest son was diagnosed with leukemia when I was in seminary. And even though that was a time when it was frightfully inconvenient for me to go or do anything because we were poor seminary students, when I got the phone call about what was going on with Trevor with his son, of course I got on a plane and I flew back to Arizona so that I could hang out with them. And 3 months later, when Trevor lost his battle with leukemia at age 6, I got on a plane 2 hours later, called my professors from the airport and said, I'm not going to be taking my finals this week. You're going to have to let me reschedule. And I flew to Arizona and actually beat his parents and her parents there. And when I called Brian, when my wife died, he says, I'm getting in a car. And I said, actually, lots of people are. Can you please wait? I need you to come about a week later if you can. And he's told me multiple times how hard it was for him not to come and be. But I needed him when I needed him. And he respected that, and he was there for me. And he stayed longer, and he and I continue to be in each other's lives, even though I live here and he lives in Montana. And he's still my best friend, and he always will be, and we will always be there for each other. That's what we do. That's how we get through the hard times, is we don't do it alone. We are never alone. God is with us. The Spirit moves through us, and Christ's way is in front of us no matter how dark things may seem. And when we are the church, and when we do church right, the way that Jesus told those 12 to do church and those 12 told the next 12 to do church, it's when we are loving and supporting one another in all of the ways that we can. When we are recognizing when we ourselves are in the dark places and reaching out to those who can help see us through. And when we are noticing when our neighbors are themselves going through the dark valleys, when we reach out to them. When we love God, love our neighbors, and love ourselves, whether life is easy or life is hard, we are following in the way that Jesus asked us to go. And we are following in the way the disciples went. And we continue God's kingdom building work here. Amen.